The Aviation Roundtable, a body that's focused on the advancement of Nigerian aviation industry, recently held its first quarter business breakfast forum. Topic of discussion was the economic implications of multiple entry points by foreign airlines into Nigeria. So joining us to discuss further and talk about the aviation industry in Africa's largest economy is Sindy Foster, who's the principal managing partner at the Avaero Capital Partners. Sindy has been a consultant to the aviation industry for over a decade and is a member of the Nigerian Aviation Policy and Strategy Group. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So as far as multiple entry points, is that as obvious as it sounds? What does that mean? Multiple international airports around the country that allow foreign airlines to come in?
Well, yes and no. So in the recent discussions about multiple entry points, there's been a bit of confusion. So generally, multiple entry points means basically an airline coming into Lagos, also coming into Abuja, also perhaps going to Kano. That's one part of the equation. But there's a bit of confusion in terms of frequencies as well. So the international airlines coming in more frequently to these entry points, and also what is termed cabotage, which is carrying domestic passengers between the international airports. Now, cabotage is something that's not legal or really possible in Nigeria, but what they're complaining about is the international airlines coming in, say from Frankfurt, and I'm not targeting any particular.
Right, of course you're not. You're just making an example. Right.
Coming in from Frankfurt to Lagos, then from Lagos going to Abuja, picking up some passengers and going back to Frankfurt. So that part of the discussion is problematic.
Okay, so good. Let's zero in on it. What is literally the problem here, as was discussed at this forum, which you participated in it, right? Yeah. Is it that the multiple entry points, as you mentioned, Frankfurt, wherever, Johannesburg, wherever, is reducing the ability of domestic airlines to operate, or what? What's the issue here specifically?
Okay, there are two issues that they've raised. One is that they feel that the international airlines are capturing domestic traffic.
Aha.
And so that's obviously a negative for them. But actually, when you look at the data, it doesn't support that.
Okay.
The other part of the equation is the international airlines, obviously, they sell their tickets in dollars. And so, the idea of the extra pressure on the CBN Forex.
Right.
So the domestic airlines are quite, irate about that.
Right.
And so they're linking the two things together and saying, well, if the international airlines aren't coming to multiple entry points, that reduces the pressure of Forex.
Indeed. Okay. We covered live when President Buhari commissioned the new international wing at the Murtala Muhammed Airport. Hadi Sirika, aviation minister, spoke at that, and he did talk about the Forex issue. I think he said about $283 million is still trapped in here, according to IATA. But to the first point, you said that there's no data to back up the fact that these multiple entry points are impacting negatively domestic airlines. No, so you've seen the data,
I've seen the data. Yeah. I've looked at the correlation between the international traffic arriving at different airports, particularly Abuja, Lagos, Kano. And actually, what it's showing is when there's an increase in international traffic, there is an increase in domestic.
That makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, logically.
Right.
If you think about it, once a passenger arrives, say, at Kano, they still have to get further into the regions. They may be travelling onto Maiduguri, they may be travelling onto Borno, they may be travelling onto any number of northern airlines which are only served by the domestic airlines. So it's an assumption which isn't supported by the stats that I have seen.
So did they provide any solutions? What did they want to reduce the amount of foreign entry points? Is that what was the outcome? What did they say would work?
What they want to do is revisit the bilateral air service agreements, BASA agreements, and see whether they can amend the BASAs to reduce the frequencies, reduce the multiple entry points of the airlines. But as I said, you can't be making recommendations without analysing the data. Right. So I looked at the data after the event because what I heard didn't make logical sense to me. So looking at the data, I think they need to be very careful about putting forward recommendations that actually is going to negatively impact their own businesses. And so one of the questions I asked was, during the COVID period, when the international airlines were not coming to Nigeria en masse,
Where domestic airlines booming, right? That's a logical question to ask. Okay, you touched on cabotage earlier. We don't have that law here, right?
Not in aviation yet. So we have a cabotage principle coming from NIMASA.
Okay.
So, and that's the marine side. And so basically, commercially, you can't carry products within Nigeria as a foreign carrier, as a foreign shipping company, whatever. And that principle really should apply within aviation because it kind of makes sense that you'd want to preserve your domestic market for your domestic airlines. But the international aspect of airlines bringing passengers in shouldn't be affected by your want to drive up your domestic.
Right.
So there seems to be a bit of a debate. We can't do the reciprocal BASA frequencies, so we should reduce those countries that can.
I see. That doesn't really work.
No, it doesn't.
All right, but speaking of international airlines, recently Air Morocco and I think Egypt Air have been making inroads into Nigeria. What does that say about the market here, in your view?
It says two things. It shows that both those airlines are looking strategically about their operations. And it also shows that they see potential within the market. So what happened prior to COVID, a lot of the traffic that was going by Egypt Air, for example, was transiting traffic to the Middle East, Dubai, for example. So they were able to offer often lower rates for the flights to Dubai. And when we had that, COVID impasse between the UAE and Nigeria, they actually capitalized on that by increasing frequencies, not only going onward to Dubai, but actually they realized that there was a point during the whole period where Nigerians couldn't go to Dubai, but Nigerians still wanted to travel. So the places that were able to attract Nigerian travelers did quite well, and Egypt was one of those. So people, instead of going to Dubai or going to America where they couldn't go, or Canada, or all these different places where we couldn't go at one point, they diverted their trips to Egypt for shopping, for leisure, and there's an increase in business travel between Egypt and Nigeria as well. And so that was a strategic decision by them which paid off. Once they did that, they actually saw further opportunities, not just to fly to Lagos. They were flying, to other areas before, but instead of just looking at entries to Lagos, they've now looked at more northern exposure as well through the Wakanau partnership that they have launched, and they've also partnered with Nanta. So a lot of the extra traffic for Egypt actually came as a result of travel agents in Nigeria doing destination marketing for Egypt. And so that kind of strategic decision by Egypt Air is what we see playing out, in terms of extra business exposure within Nigeria. And Air Morocco, similar story. So they've been here for many, many, many years. They don't carry a huge amount of passengers when you compare them to Ethiopian Airlines, et cetera, So there's potential for them to grow their customer base. So they're looking at not just because aviation isn't like a short-term thing. You've got to look at the long term. Nigeria has got a growing population. There's a debate whether the middle class is becoming more prosperous or actually in decline.
That's correct.
And also the propensity to fly. The propensity to fly from Nigeria is actually lower than other African countries, most of the African countries. And so there's opportunities for growth there. If you can lower the cost of travel, you can attract more passengers. If you can have better connectivity within Africa, you can increase the number of passengers. Because, if you're a business traveller, you don't want to spend, a day and a bit travelling to one destination for a meeting and then come back. So all of these deficiencies within the Nigerian system, I don't know whether you can only fly to 13 African countries from Nigeria direct. So it means that there's scope for more. And no one's really managed to solve that problem of low connectivity. So whichever airline manages to do that,
they win. You did mention, I noticed you mentioned lowering the cost of travel. There's been aviation fuel issues where, aviation fuel has skyrocketed, I think, from 197 naira per litre to over 600 or so. How do you ride out that storm for the domestic carriers? Is it government bailout? Is it raising ticket fare? How do you see that working out?
I'm not an advocate for government bailouts because I think it just encourages inefficiencies. And so in terms of the aviation sector, there are certain things that you can do. You can reduce your schedules in terms of if you were flying to one destination 4 times in a day, you can reduce it to maybe 3. You can consolidate your flights so that you encourage more fuller flights. Because the load capacity matters. Whether you fly with, 25% of passengers or 75% of passengers, you still have to fuel your entire aircraft. So it's better to encourage a fuller aircraft. Some of the Nigerian airlines have got mixed fleet. I don't want to name names because it will look like I'm advertising
I understand.
them. Yeah. But some of them have got the opportunity of swapping to more energy efficient aircraft. And so some of those are bigger aircraft, and so you can actually consolidate some of your schedules into one large aircraft, pack that out and fill it with fuel, and then that's better.
Okay.
The other thing they can do is to do bulk purchasing of fuel. At the moment, they do like on-the-day spot purchases. So, and they do it individually as airlines. So you're not going to get the economies of scale when it comes to fuel purchases. Whereas there is a bit of a trend in terms of associations bulk buying. Okay. And I noticed that AFRA were looking at that as part of their strategy for future reduction in costs as per aviation fuel.
All right.
In Nigeria, we've got Spring Alliance. So I'm waiting to see whether Spring Alliance is going to look at importing fuel in bulk on behalf of, or AON, because you've got AON, which is the Airline Operators of Nigeria, who were the ones who were presenting their case to the
government. Yep.
But you've also got the Spring Alliance as well. So we've got to see how it's going to work out. Now, whether it's going to reduce the cost of fuel is debatable because the cost of fuel is an inherited cost because we don't refine aviation fuel here.
Right.
So unless you are able to purchase in sufficient bulk so that the cost that you were purchasing wholesale is, less than the retail price that the fuel marketers were giving you, how's it going to change anything?
Right.
We should be looking strategically at future. We should be looking at local refining of aviation fuel. And we should actually be looking beyond aviation fuel in terms of Jet A1. We should be looking at sustainable aviation fuels because Africa is endowed with so many of the raw materials for sustainable aviation fuels. And what's happening is, in the usual manner, these resources will be collected and carried away, refined and sold back to us.
Right.
So we need to be thinking further ahead than the crisis that we are currently in and looking at how we can mitigate that from being a continuing problem in the future. Because obviously crude oil is a diminishing
resource.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so therefore the cost of oil is going to fluctuate. It's going to be on an upward trajectory for a while, which means that aviation fuel, which is a product of crude oil, is going to also be increasing and becoming increasingly scarce. Now, I'm not sure that we've seen the shocks of the Ukraine war yet.
Really? Even with oil for where it is? Yeah.
Yeah, because part of what we are experiencing now is an impact of COVID. Because when the airlines stopped flying, a lot of the refineries diverted their processing to other oil products. So there was a sort of a gap in terms of supply and demand when it came to the availability of Jet A1. Now, the US identified this way back in July last year, and they started to take strategic decisions in terms of closing some smaller airports, reducing the supply, etc., etc. But here, we waited for it to happen, and now we're talking about it.
Excellent stuff. There's so much more to discuss. I wanted to ask you about National Carrier, but we've run out of time. We have to have you back. Great conversation. Sindy Foster, Principal Managing Partner at Avaero Capital Partners. Thank you so much for taking us through the aviation industry. We really appreciate that.